Lecture 3, Statistical Inference 2, Hypothesis Testing, Interval Estimation and Bayesian Inference. Now Lecture 3 is the second of our two lectures on the foundations of statistical inference. And in this lecture I'm going to talk about hypothesis testing, interval estimation, and I'm also going to introduce the underlying philosophy of the Bayesian paradigm for inference. There are 6 parts to the lecture. First, as usual, I will outline the learning outcomes. We will then look in part 2 at the key elements of hypothesis testing, followed in part 3 of the lecture by a review of specific methods that we use to test hypotheses. In part 4, we'll turn to the objective of interval estimation, and in part 5, I will talk about Bayesian inference. And then finally, in the final part of the lecture, part 6, I will summarise what we have learned. So, in terms of learning outcomes in this second lecture on statistical inference, at the end of this lecture you should be able to identify the key elements that we use to conduct a statistical hypothesis test. You will be able to apply formal criteria to test hypotheses concerning population parameters. Following our discussion of specific methods of hypothesis testing, you should be able to distinguish particular approaches given underlying statistical models and test criteria. You will be able to form and calculate confidence intervals for parameters by inverting test statistics. And finally, regarding the Bayesian inferential paradigm, you should understand the key concepts that feature in that particular approach to inference. So this is the second lecture on inference, and just to make the link to the previous lecture, this is really part of the same lecture. I've split the material and inference into 2 parts because there's a lot of material and it would be too much for one single lecture, but we're actually still on the same subject of statistical inference. So the definitions and the examples are going to follow straight on from the last lecture, in which we at the beginning of that lecture defined 3 objectives that form the focus of inference. First, parameter estimation, which we covered in lecture 2. Second, hypothesis testing, that's the second objective, so test specific hypothesis about parameters in light of data X. And the third objective that we cover is interval estimation, and in that objective we want to be able to compute an uncertainty interval within which the true value of the parameter lies. So the first objective, parameter estimation, covered in lecture 2, and in this lecture we're now going to turn to objectives 2 and 3 of inference, that is hypothesis testing and interval estimation. But we'll also introduce the philosophy underpinning the Bayesian approach to inference, and we'll talk about Bayesian estimation, and we'll also talk about Bayesian interval estimation.